On a quiet Alabama morning in 1932, 600 black men lined up outside a small county clinic, believing they were about to receive free medical treatment from the United States government. They trusted the doctors. They trusted the nurses. They trusted the white-coated authority of science and the promise of help during the hardest years of the Great Depression. None of them knew that the decision they were making that day would condemn many of them to slow suffering, madness, blindness, insanity, and death, and that the government of the United States would watch it happen for the next 40 years without intervening. This is not a rumor. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is one of the darkest, most shocking true stories in American history. It began in Macon County, Alabama, where poverty clung to the land as tightly as the red clay. Most of the men were sharecroppers. Many could not read or write. Nearly all of them trusted authority because they had been taught from birth that questioning it could be dangerous. When representatives from the U.S. Public Health Service arrived and announced a special program offering free health care, hot meals, transportation, and burial insurance, it sounded like a miracle. They were told they had bad blood, a vague term used at the time to describe everything from fatigue to anemia to venereal disease. They were not told the truth. What they actually had, or were being tested for, was syphilis, a bacterial infection that, if untreated, slowly destroys the body and mind. The study was officially named the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. Even the title, written in sterile government language, concealed a moral horror. The purpose was not to cure. The purpose was to observe. The men were never meant to get better. At the time the study began, there was no reliable cure for syphilis. The researchers claimed they simply wanted to observe the natural progression of the disease. But medicine advanced. By the 1940s, penicillin was proven to be a safe and effective cure. By the end of World War II, it was widely available. American soldiers were being treated with it. Prisoners were being treated with it. Civilians were being treated with it. The men in Tuskegee were not. Doctors actively prevented them from receiving treatment. When some attempted to enlist in the military and were diagnosed during physical exams, the U.S. Public Health Service intervened to ensure they were excluded because treatment would contaminate the study. When local physicians tried to help, they were instructed not to. When national treatment programs were launched, the men were quietly left out. The study was extended again and again, justified with new paperwork, new signatures, and the same cold logic. Data was more important than lives. What makes this story even more disturbing is how ordinary it was. It was not conducted by mad scientists in secret laboratories. It was carried out by respected doctors, published in medical journals, funded by government budgets, and discussed at professional conferences. Nurses developed relationships with the men, earning their trust while unknowingly or knowingly guiding them toward harm. One nurse in particular, Eunice Rivers, became the human bridge between the government and the participants, reassuring them for decades that everything was fine. Some of the men went blind, some went insane, some died in agony. Their wives were infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. Funerals were attended by government representatives who took notes, and still the study continued. By the 1960s, America was changing. Civil rights protests filled the streets. Trust in government was beginning to crack. Yet inside the Public Health Service, the Tuskegee study remained protected by silence and bureaucracy. Younger doctors who raised ethical concerns were ignored. Internal memos acknowledged the moral problem, but concluded that stopping the study would be regrettable due to the loss of long-term data. It took one man to finally break the wall. In 1972, a whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked information about the study to the press. When the story appeared in national newspapers, the reaction was explosive. Americans were stunned that their own government had allowed such cruelty in the name of science. Congressional hearings followed. The study was finally terminated 40 years after it began. By then, dozens of men had died directly from syphilis. Many more had suffered irreversible damage. Their survivors were elderly, confused, and betrayed. In 1997, 65 years after the first men were recruited, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. But an apology cannot restore lost lives. It cannot undo decades of pain, and it cannot erase the truth. The Tuskegee Study permanently changed medical ethics in America. It led to new laws, informed consent requirements, and institutional review boards. Yet it also left a deep scar, a reason why many African Americans still distrust the healthcare system today. That distrust is not inherited paranoia, it is inherited memory. And Tuskegee was not an isolated case.
The public wanted to believe Tuskegee was an aberration, a single moral failure in an otherwise honorable system, a mistake made long ago by people who did not understand ethics the way modern America did. That belief was comforting. It was also false, because while the men of Tuskegee were being observed, ignored, and allowed to die in Alabama, other experiments were unfolding across the United States, quietly, methodically, and with the same justification: the advancement of science. In the years following World War II, America emerged as a global superpower. It also emerged deeply afraid. The Cold War transformed fear into policy, and policy into permission. The Soviet Union was no longer just a rival. It was an existential threat. American officials worried constantly about falling behind in weapons, in intelligence, in science, and most of all, in understanding the human mind. What if the enemy had discovered how to control thoughts? What if they could break prisoners without torture? What if they could turn soldiers into weapons without loyalty? These questions were not discussed in public. They were discussed behind closed doors in Washington, D.C., and they led to some of the most disturbing human experiments ever conducted by a democratic government. In 1953, the CIA launched a program known internally as MK Ultra. Its mission was deceptively simple: to explore whether drugs, psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, and trauma could be used to control human behavior. Its execution was anything but simple. The program operated in fragments, dozens of sub-projects spread across universities, hospitals, prisons, and military facilities. Many of the researchers involved did not even know they were working for the CIA. Grants were laundered through foundations. Paper trails were intentionally obscured. Oversight was minimal to non-existent. Subjects were rarely informed. In some cases, they were prisoners offered reduced sentences. In others, they were psychiatric patients told they were receiving treatment. In still others, they were ordinary American citizens, people who walked into bars, clinics, or hospitals and unknowingly became test subjects. One such man was Frank Olson, a civilian scientist working for the U.S. Army. In 1953, he attended a retreat with colleagues. Without his knowledge, his drink was secretly laced with LSD as part of a CIA experiment on unwitting subjects. Olson suffered a severe psychological breakdown. 9 days later, he fell or was pushed from a hotel window in New York City. His death was ruled a suicide. His family was told nothing. For decades. It was not until the 1970s, when investigations into intelligence abuses began to surface, that Olson's family learned the truth. He had been drugged by his own government. Later evidence would suggest the official explanation of his death might not have been complete. His body was exhumed, new injuries were found, questions multiplied, answers never fully came. Olson was not alone. At Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, inmates were subjected to chemical experiments for years. Substances were applied directly to their skin, some toxic, some hallucinogenic, some never fully identified. The prisoners signed consent forms, but consent obtained in a prison environment, especially for poor, desperate men, was consent in name only. At Willowbrook State School in New York, a facility for children with intellectual disabilities, researchers deliberately infected children with hepatitis to study the disease's progression. Parents were told it was for science. Some were told admission depended on participation. The children had no voice. At military bases, soldiers were exposed to nerve agents, radiation, and experimental drugs. Many were told it was routine testing. Some were ordered to comply. Years later, veterans would develop cancers, neurological disorders, and chronic illnesses, only to be told there was no record of their exposure. The pattern was always the same. Select a population with limited power, minimize disclosure, document everything internally, deny everything publicly, and when questions arose, the response was silence. By the late 1960s, the ethical cracks were impossible to ignore. America was watching government credibility collapse under the weight of Vietnam, Watergate, and civil rights abuses. Whistleblowers became harder to suppress. Journalists became more aggressive. Congressional oversight, once a formality, became a weapon. In 1975, the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, launched a sweeping investigation into U.S. intelligence activities. What it uncovered shocked even seasoned lawmakers: assassination plots, domestic spying, illegal surveillance, and buried among the documents, MK Ultra. CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered many MK Ultra files destroyed years earlier. Even so, enough survived to reveal the scale of the program. LSD experiments, hypnosis trials, electroshock, sensory deprivation chambers, long-term psychological damage. No accountability. When questioned, officials used a familiar defense: national security. But the public was no longer satisfied with that answer. What made these revelations especially painful was the realization that Tuskegee, MK Ultra, Willowbrook, and countless other cases were not exceptions. They were expressions of a mindset, a belief that some lives were more expendable than others if the outcome promised progress. Poor, black, incarcerated, disabled, mentally ill, uninformed. These were the people science used when it needed silence. As outrage grew, lawsuits followed. Compensation was offered in some cases, denied in others. Apologies were carefully worded. Institutions rebranded. Laws were rewritten. Ethics boards were created. Informed consent became a legal requirement. The system changed, not because it wanted to, but because it was forced to.
By the time the investigations ended, the damage was already woven into the fabric of American life. The men of Tuskegee were old or gone. The prisoners of Holmesburg carried scars no doctor could explain. The children of Willowbrook grew into adults with bodies that had been deliberately harmed in the name of research. Soldiers returned home sick, confused, and dismissed. Families lived with unanswered questions, sensing betrayal long before proof ever arrived. And something else had happened, something less visible, but just as permanent. Trust had been broken. Not just trust in medicine, not just trust in science, but trust in authority itself. For generations, Americans had been taught that their institutions, though imperfect, ultimately worked for the public good. Doctors healed, scientists cured, government protected. The revelations of the 1970s shattered that narrative. What replaced it was not clarity, but suspicion. Why didn't anyone stop it sooner? Who decided these lives were expendable? And how many experiments were never discovered? The government responded the only way it could, by building rules. Informed consent became the cornerstone of ethical research. Institutional review boards were created to oversee experiments. The Belmont Report laid out 3 guiding principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. These reforms were real and they mattered. They prevented countless abuses. But laws do not erase memory. Within African American communities, Tuskegee became more than history. It became warning. Parents told children. Churches repeated the story. Skepticism toward hospitals, vaccines, and public health initiatives did not arise from ignorance. It arose from experience passed down through bloodlines. Public officials struggled to understand why medical outreach sometimes failed. They blamed misinformation. They blamed culture. Rarely did they acknowledge the simplest explanation. People who have been lied to for 40 years do not forget. And the consequences reached far beyond healthcare. As trust in institutions weakened, the vacuum filled with alternatives. Conspiracy theories flourished, not because Americans suddenly became irrational, but because official narratives had been proven unreliable before. When the government admitted decades later that it had secretly drugged citizens, infected children, and observed men die untreated, it became harder to dismiss skepticism as paranoia. The line between reasonable doubt and dangerous misinformation blurred. This was the unintended legacy of human experimentation in America. Even within the scientific community, scars remained. Young researchers studied ethics not as abstract philosophy, but as cautionary history. Every consent form, every review board meeting, every disclosure carried an unspoken reminder of what happened when oversight failed. Yet power has a way of returning to old habits. After September 11, 2001, fear once again reshaped policy. National security was invoked. Detention centers appeared. Interrogation techniques were rebranded. The language changed, but the logic felt familiar. Extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. History did not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymed. Documents later revealed psychological experiments on detainees. Behavioral science informed interrogation methods. Lawyers argued definitions. Committees debated legality. Once again, decisions were made in rooms far removed from those who would bear the consequences. And once again, years later, the public learned fragments of the truth. This is the pattern America struggles with. Progress followed by secrecy, security followed by justification, regret followed by reform. Each cycle leaves behind victims whose names are rarely remembered. Frank Olson, the unnamed men of Tuskegee, children at Willowbrook, prisoners with chemical burns, soldiers who trusted orders. They are not symbols, they were people. In 1997, when President Clinton finally apologized for Tuskegee, he said something quietly profound. What the United States government did was shameful. Not mistaken, not misguided, shameful. That word matters, because shame implies moral awareness. It implies that those in power knew at some level that what they were doing was wrong and continued anyway. The true lesson of this history is not that America is uniquely cruel. It is that America is human, and humans, when granted unchecked authority, are capable of justifying almost anything. The safeguards built after these scandals exist for a reason. They are not bureaucratic obstacles. They are memorials, written not in stone but in policy, designed to protect future generations from repeating the past. But safeguards only work if they are defended, because the most dangerous experiments are not the ones conducted in hidden basements or classified files. They are the ones conducted openly, under respectable names, with good intentions, and the quiet assumption that someone else will ask the hard questions. History shows us what happens when no one does. This story is not meant to inspire fear, it is meant to demand vigilance, because the distance between progress and abuse is not measured in technology, but in ethics, and ethics, once compromised, do not collapse all at once. They erode slowly, quietly, until one day a nation looks back and wonders how it allowed the unthinkable to become routine. America asked for knowledge. It received it, and the cost was human lives. That is the truth history does not soften, and it is why remembering these stories is not optional, it is necessary.